Welcome to Akasha Talks, a podcast on consciousness, healing, and different ways to interact and weave those together, both old and new, to be able to get the most out of your life. I'm your host, Lance Baker, coming to you from Newcastle, Australia. Hope you kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome back by popular demand, Matt Dragonstone. How are you, buddy?
I'm well, my friend. How are you? Thanks for having me
Great.
back.
Oh, can't not. The people obviously missed you because I've done one episode in between the last time you're on. But that's how it is. I only put these on now when I've got something that I'm excited about sharing. Uh, you're popping up in my life too often, buddy.
Oh, look, there's always a reason for it, mate, and I'm very
Yes.
happy to be back. So, there are worse places to pop up, my friend.
So what we're going to be doing today, everyone, is something we promised you a year ago. 2 years ago, I invited Matt on to talk about the chart of Australia. I should have looked up what number it was. Probably 5 or 6 episodes ago, he was on to talk about the chart of Australia and explain the dynamics of who Australia is under astrology. And it was really interesting. I recommend you go check out at least the first half of that. The second half, we did what we're about to do here today, a year ahead on what's in store for Australia as a country. And I promised I'd do it for 2024. Life pooped all over me and got me too busy and distracted. So that didn't happen. uh, and so we're doing it this year with 2025 because a bunch of people have requested it and I'm keen to know as well. And I'm sick of hearing, like I said 2 years ago, about everybody talking about America's chart and its Pluto return and all the rest of the stuff of that. I don't live in America. I don't care about that. A little bit because it affects us with what our government decides to do. But I'm Australian. I want to know what's in store for Australia. And at least half of the people that listen to this show are Australian, uh, like Matt. And what what this episode is going to have a lot of visual things of slides Matt's prepared of the astrology. So if you're just listening, you'll get a lot out of listening, but you'll probably get a little bit more if you watch it on your phone or computer on YouTube. You can go there. I'm going to pause for 2 seconds for you to do it. No, I'm not, because you're just going to press stop. And so, Matt, thank you for coming. Uh, are you excited?
I'm very excited, Lance. I am, to be honest with you. And look, I mean, my mantra for 2025 is get excited. There's a lot of stuff to get excited about. And I think that, what we can do today is maybe look at the astrology for Australia, for the federal government of Australia. And there's a reason why we'll look at that as opposed to any other way of cutting the data, with a view to empowering the people, the yous and me's and the people who go to work for a living, in terms of how you can make the most of this year relative to what the government is going to be doing, and whether that's sort of helpful for us or not. We're going to try and make sure you've got a pathway into making the most out of 2025.
Yes, I'm excited for this with some of the big things that you shared with me briefly before about the things you've seen coming there. I can see having the awareness of this is going to change how much it affects our lives and how much we can just be happy without stressing out of things we don't need to stress out of.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And sometimes that sort of necessitates a change in mindset for certain sort of parts of our lives, but that's not unusual. That's not contained to just 2025, for instance. We're constantly challenged to change our mindset and to adapt to the outside weather, which is how I describe, the broader astrological space weather and how that relates to whatever it is that you're measuring it against. In this instance, we're looking at the federal government. So, I mean, there's constant ways that you can sort of tweak and refine and, where necessary, do some deeper work to change your mindset about a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I've seen in 2025 when I've looked at the astrology is the necessity of understanding a little bit more things like where is the information coming from and what are we being told, as opposed to what's actually happening. For example,
Yes. Okay. That makes sense. That's great.
cool,
Right.
cool.
So, when we talk about the year of 2025, I remember last time it doesn't start on the 1st of January. Where do we start today, mate?
Well, there are many ways to skin a cat, my friend. And
No, no animals were harmed in the recording of this episode.
yeah, we're not advocating you to actually skin a cat, gentle listener. But what I mean by that is that there's multiple ways that you can look at and measure and predict what's going to happen. One of the ways that I like when it comes to mundane astrology, and by mundane astrology, I mean the branch of astrology that's concerned with mapping political developments over a stretch of time. So for mundane or political astrology, I like to look at the point at which the sun ingresses into very particular signs, in specifically the cardinal signs. So Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and then back to Capricorn again. So for me, 2025 kind of begins on the 21st of December 2024, which is where we're going to start. And to kind of simplify things, we look at the exact moment that the sun enters Capricorn, imagining that we're sitting in the center of Parliament House, basically. So we look at the administrative and legislative center of whatever country you want to do this for. For us, it's Canberra. If you were in the United States, it would be Washington, D.C. If you were in England, it would be London, etc., etc. And then we look at which house does the sun land in? Where are the planets scattered across the chessboard, so to speak? And I'm going to share my screen here so my white balance doesn't go apeshit all episode. And just let me know when you can see what I can see.
We can see it now. We can.
Ah, good, good. And I'll just be the ghostly figure in the corner. I've got a new webcam, by the way, guys. So it makes me look like I'm either in the middle of the sun or in a darkened room in a basement dungeon somewhere. So what we're looking at the moment is the moment when the sun entered Capricorn, the 21st of December 2024 at 8:20 p.m. in Australia, in Canberra. And the planets are the same for wherever you are in the world. It's just the ascendant and the midheaven and the ways in which those planets are scattered around the different houses that changes from country to country or from legislative body to legislative body. You could do this for Victoria or New South Wales or the Northern Territory or wherever. But for us, there's a very particular picture that begins to be painted when we look at the Capricorn ingress chart for 2024. And we're going to do this again at the spring equinox with the ingress into Aries. So it kind of covers that first 4 months, 3 months of 2025. But we begin it in the sort of last week of December 2024, more or less.
And full transparency for everybody of the predictions Matt makes from this point till the 3rd of January is all based on what happened because it's the 3rd of January.
Well, you know, if we were in a more efficient country, then there would actually be some truth to that. But we all know that we clock off in Australia at the beginning of December and we kind of come back in February. There's not a
Yes.
lot. There's not a lot that happens.
No.
Um, but at the same time, like I've got a bit of a rhetorical question before we get into this, because I'm interested in if something happens for the federal government, because what we're doing is we're measuring Australia by virtue of the federal government of Australia, because that gives us a date and time for the birth of that legislative body, for us to go off, right, for all intents and purposes. Does it paint a fuller picture, like an absolute full, complete picture of Australia? It doesn't. Does it paint a full and complete picture for you and I on the ground? No, it only does it partially. But effectively, like if something happens in the bowels of Canberra, how the hell do we know about it? Where's our sources of information, Lance, just generally?
Oh, it's by the media that's owned by like two people.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
mate.
or if you've got a mate in government, which I sadly don't. So Yeah, we don't get it till they're telling us, and in what way that it's spun.
Yeah.
Um, but I imagine a lot of things we find out a lot slower, and especially with some of the things you've said that we're dealing with, since it's a very media heavy year and people in the background and communications, that there's a lot of pencil pushers that are doing things that lots of the federal government still probably won't know about themselves for another few weeks into each of these bits, because emails are going to go backwards and forwards and contracts done and all the rest of that.
And committees and subcommittees and, all of this legislative sort of acrobatics that the government kind of do in order to kind of, push ahead with sometimes an agenda that's radically different to what we're told as the general punters, as the yous and me's, right? So there's a house for that. What we're looking at on the screen, folks, is a chart for the Capricorn ingress. And for those that aren't 100% across astrology, the slices of the pie here are each about 30 degrees using the house system that I use, which is whole sign houses. They're 30 degrees and there's 12 of them. And 12 times 30 is 360 degrees. And it represents the sky at 8:20 p.m. on the 21st of December 2024. And each of these slices are called houses. And there's a house for everything. The first house, which is where we see the AS symbol just here, represents the health of the nation as a whole. It's a good little barometer for how things are going generally. The one next to it, number two is, the wealth and the banking. And number three, which is where I'll stop, I won't go all the way around the chart. Number three is the spin house, right? Number three is communications. It's the media. It's a whole bunch of stuff that's actually really interesting for the purposes of mundane astrology. It's telecommunications, it's transportation, it's roads, it's rail, it's pipelines, it's news media, post offices, our neighbors, our neighboring nations, whether the border is by land or by sea. And what we're going to see over the next 12 months in just about every bloody ingress chart that we'll look at tonight is something significant either living in or sort of planted in the third house or connected in some way to the third house. So the name of the game in 2025 for Australia is what's the fucking story? And is the story a believable one or not? And why are we being told the stories that we're being told by the government? And so when I look at the Capricorn ingress chart for Canberra 2024, there's two things that I notice straight up off the bat, which is the moon, which represents in political astrology the general people, you and I basically. That's in the third house immediately, and it's in 13 degrees of Virgo, and it's exactly opposite to the degree to Saturn in the ninth house at 13 degrees of Pisces, and the ascendant, which represents the general health of the nation. That's 1 degree of Cancer, right? So the moon is ruling the ascendant and it's being hammered by Saturn in the ninth house. And it's also 180 degrees opposite to the sun. The sun at zero Capricorn, obviously, is in the seventh house as a result of this. And so what we see with the Capricorn chart is that the people are kind of in charge, in a sense, for that first 3 months of the year. Or at the very least, we're being fed a narrative through the media sources in the government that we're empowered, basically, which is nice, right? So the people, the moon, nice and kind of, you would think in theory, nice and happy and kind of, comfortable with the story that we're being fed. But when you look deeper, there's an opposition from Saturn in the ninth. And when you look even deeper still, Jupiter is at 14 degrees of Gemini, and that's kind of forming what's known as an overcoming square to the moon at 13 degrees of Virgo. So there's tension, right? We begin 2025 with tension about the stories that we're being told and about the communicative functions that we're using and the ways in which we communicate with each other. Incidentally, the third house is also the house of the internet, and news and media also covers social media as well. So to kind of delve a little bit deeper, the ninth house, which is where we find the opposition from Saturn, that's courts. Ninth house represents courts. It represents universities. It represents religious institutions. And the planet that's in the ninth house, the authorities represented by Saturn, are in opposition to the people. And they're in opposition to the people specifically in terms of communications and media, including social media. And the intercession of Jupiter forming a aspect pattern known as a T-square from the 12th house, which represents secret enemies, kind of puts us in this tense position as the general populace relative to the laws that are being passed about media and communications straight off the bat. Straight off the bat. And if I recall correctly, I don't have the exact dates that the legislation was passed, but we finished off 2024 with the social media ban. That's a very Saturnian word, for people under the age of 16, for instance, which we all think is great because the story that we're being told is this will keep our children safe from pedos, and rightly so. But the reality, when we dig deeper, because of the involvement of Jupiter from the 12th house in that overcoming square, seems to point more towards the slow legislative kind of engulfment of the free communication and the anonymity promised by the internet, at least in the form that we think it is, basically. That's one example of the way in which 2025 is the year of information, the year of spin, and the year of propaganda.
And so this is where it's helpful if we reflect back 5 years now to what was happening of spins and stories, to not get hyped up and stressed out about what's on your TV.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
guess that's going to change more as we get through the year, since this is the theme again and again with different ways. The people are not going to be in that spot all year. This is just the first chunk.
Not by a bloody long shot, basically, is my response to that. Because, let's not discount the position of Mercury at 8 degrees of Sagittarius, forming, loosely with an orb of about 5 degrees, a pattern called a cardinal cross. What this means from my perspective, particularly if we just focus on the sign and house placement of the moon, is that the people have a pretty damn long memory that goes back about 5 years and are probably less willing to swallow the bullshit um, as we enter into the first months of 2025. And so any kind of legislative introduction from the government, particularly as it relates to foreign affairs, and we'll get to that shortly, because that's another really, really important facet of Australia's political future for 2025, is our relationship with foreign governments that aren't necessarily our neighbours. But any sort of legislative introduction that we might see in the first couple of months of 2025 relative to things like misinformation, disinformation, and the stories that we're fed about why that's necessary, I don't necessarily think that the people are just going to swallow that holus bolus, because a grand cross where it implicates the moon and Jupiter and Saturn and Mercury does not make for easy digestion. It's a series of oppositions and squares. And so it's going to be very hard for the government to pass enough spin and feed us enough propaganda to make us swallow any kind of legislative attempts, and in the first couple of months at least.
Yep. And I guess that's the sixth house as well. So that's day to day. People are just saying bullshit.
Yeah, yeah. Sixth house is, well, I mean, it's health
Yes,
for a start. The sixth house is health, and it represents workers, the civil service. So, your kind of public servants, basically. Workers and employees, labor unions, and let's not forget the big Woolies fucking fiasco. I don't know if it made it all the way up to New South Wales where you are, but in Victoria there was a massive strike from the Woolworths
Yes.
warehouse workers. That Grand Cross really was representative of the last days of 2024. And we all thought Woolies was going to fold, right? And it's interesting that the house that's implicated in this Grand Cross includes the third house, which is overland transportation. And the ninth house is transportation by air and sea as well. And that's all locked into this really tense pattern where it's difficult to push things through. So we find that a lot of the a lot of the populace represented by that moon in Virgo is kind of questioning what it's being fed, both symbolically and literally in the case of the Woolworths example. But information and the ways in which that information is being fed to us doesn't necessarily look as immediately palatable and unquestioningly sweet as it may have in previous years, like for instance 5 years ago. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So, all of this is happening within the context of leadership. And the most important part of any ingress chart, aside from the moon, is the sun, because the sun represents the rulers. It represents Albo. God help him, one way or another. This guy fucking cops it this year, I swear. So, okay, so we look at the house placement of the sun to give us an indication of where the ruling class or the ruler, the king or whatever it may be, the prime minister, where their head's at and what's motivating a lot of the action that's being sort of described in the ingress chart for that particular quarter. For us, it's opposite, like I mentioned before, opposite the ascendant. The sun is in the seventh house in this ingress chart, and so the seventh house is foreign affairs, basically. So the people are kind of being fed this sort of hold music or this out of office reply because the leader is really, really preoccupied with foreign affairs, particularly given that the ruler of the sun in this chart, which is Saturn, is in the ninth house opposing the moon. My sort of call for this is that Albo is deep, deep in trade relations talks and legislative talks with foreign governments about partnerships and about deals, and that it's implicated at a legislative and I guess sort of also academic institution level, basically with that ruler of the sun ruling the sun in the seventh from the ninth. And so, what we're seeing in terms of the work that the rulers will be doing in the first kind of couple of months of 2025 is we're going to be seeing a lot of talk, a very sanitized version of that, being given to us about trade deals and about partnerships and particularly strategic partnerships with foreign countries, including our neighbors, but also probably more so the alliances that we're trying to build strategically to defend ourselves militarily if necessary moving forward. So that's whoever's running the UK right now and the incoming President Cheezel in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And because that's in Capricorn, would that mean he's most likely making smarter business decisions or not?
I would say not.
Okay.
Um, just generally, and that's not because I'm, loosely an anarcho-syndicalist and I hate governments, but But I think he's got a hard task ahead of him because the ruler of the sun, right? The planet that's in charge of more or less directing where the sun as ruler kind of directs his or her gaze, is in the ninth house, but it's locked into this grand cross, which means that there's conflicting stories. There's a whole bunch of subterfuge happening with Jupiter intervening. Jupiter's not in a good position in this chart. It's retrograde. It's in a sign of detriment, which means that it's opposite the sign of its rulership. Likewise, it's opposite its own ruler, which is itself in a sign of detriment. And the moon generally doesn't necessarily like being in Virgo, and it's ruling the ascendant. And on top of that, the midheaven is in Aries, and it's a 21 degrees Aries. It's ruled by a retrograde Mars in the second house of money and finances. So the midheaven has this kind of separating conjunction from Chiron and ruled by Mars in the second house. As we recall, it's the house of wealth and banks. Our public image, such as it is going to be dictated by a lot of financial transactions at first under the guise of trade deals, and then is going to kind of take a little bit more of a Marshall stance in terms of financial deals that will allow us to form strategic partnerships moving forward. And this is kind of, it's 50% a prediction based on the chart and 50% my understanding of how the news media works in Australia and the
Yep.
story that we're probably going to be fed in the lead up to March.
Okay. And well, with Mars there, I can't remember when is it Mars clicks back into Pisces, into Cancer.
Into Cancer. Well, it clicks back into Cancer in a couple of days, actually. So I'm pretty sure we get Mars retrograde for at least the first month of 2025. It's retrograde in Cancer at the end of January. It's retrograde in Cancer at the end of February. It's retrograde in Cancer. Oh, it's direct in Cancer, sorry, at the end of March, which is just in time for the Sun to move into Aries, again ruled by Mars. So there's a lot of I guess rulerships dictated by Mars in the first couple of months, but thankfully from Capricorn to Aries, we've got Mars just ruling the midheaven, and we've got Saturn ruling the Sun, but kind of hamstrung by a bunch of opposition from the people, and also opposition from the workers, effectively public servants and otherwise, as well as a bit of hidden enemy stuff from the 12th house. But for those first couple of months of 2025, Mars's condition as it rules the midheaven is going to be moving backwards through Cancer, a sign that is its fall. It's the opposite of the sign of its exaltation. So it's going to be, in a nutshell, very difficult for the government to push through legislative change in the months leading up to March, and the ingress into Aries. That's not going to stop the government from trying, but at the same time, a lot of that change we'll see later in the year, as for instance, the sun moves kind of out of the seventh house. But for Capricorn ingress season, at least leading up until March, the sun is very much firmly in the seventh house, very much tied into foreign affairs. And our public image, our midheaven, is tied into the ways in which those foreign affairs and trade deals are kind of linked to a martial understanding of money that's in itself retrograde.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And so now I guess we move on to the next one.
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I think it's interesting. So, it's an
yeah.
info dump.
Yes.
It's a fucking info dump, so feel free to discuss.
Uh, yeah. Well, it it sounds like there's going to be some stress heads going on in government,
Yeah, yeah.
and we're going to be confused with most of what we get.
I think
Not
so.
believing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great way of summing it up, basically. We're going to be confused with the messaging we're getting. The government won't know what's happening because a lot of its decision making is tied into seventh house matters. That is, it's dependent on other governments and foreign affairs, particularly. And I feel like that's not only a sort of local neighborhood scenario, it's probably also, I guess, America and the UK and whatever kind of wider groups we're a part of, the G20, the G8, the whatever it is. This is kind of going to be where a lot of the government's sort of time and energy is spent. Meanwhile, at home, it's a question of, you know, I guess, kind of delaying the populace as much as possible, even though we're all totally fucking sus as to what we're being told and how that may or may not reflect reality. It's a problem that the government seeks in the first couple of months to control but can't, because that opposition to Saturn is itself hamstrung by a square from, or a square from Mercury loosely, but definitely a square from Jupiter as well. Yeah.
So with this sort of stuff, it can sound bad, but the point of astrology is to see what's coming, to
Yeah.
not get kicked over and swept off your feet. Just breathe in between what you hear, and focus on your own little backyard. rather than those messages. And I guess if you want to do illegal things on the internet, make use of it now. Download your torrents.
Yeah, get that onion browser and go for it.
Don't. That's bad advice.
Yeah, look, I mean, what we're looking at again, just a baseline, is we're looking at the federal government of Australia, and that only has, for most of us, it has a pretty light touch in our lives. I don't necessarily subscribe to the theory that the government controls absolutely every aspect of our lives. I think that short of getting those text messages from MyGov saying that you've got a new inbox message and having a panic attack, there's very few other ways that the government's kind of role in our day-to-day lives is pronounced enough for us to even notice, to be completely honest with you. The charts and the things that we're looking at are just federal government as opposed to state or local government. They're not, for instance, the chart of your family or even your own nativity. So just because the weather outside might not look amazing, it doesn't mean that there aren't ways for you to navigate that. And it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be bad news for you. But it's better to know what's coming down the pike rather than being surprised.
Exactly. Yes.
Cool bananas. All right, let's have a look at Aries. So we start off on the 21st of December, and then the astrological new year occurs for us on the 20th of March 2025 at 8:02 p.m. daylight savings time in Canberra. And what do you fucking know, Lance? Look at that third house. Where's the moon?
That's the third house again.
Where's the fucking sun, mate? Sorry, I don't mean to swear so much. It's an Australian podcast. No, it's
It's
okay.
to
We
the
can swear.
seventh. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. It's in the seventh fucking house. All right. Okay. So we have a cardinal sign on the ascendant again. It just so happens to be the opposite sign to the sun. And using whole sign houses, the sun is still in the seventh house. The moon is still in the third house. This time, the moon is ruling the midheaven. But the 10th house, which contains the midheaven for us, is also sort of where Mars, now stationary or now moving forward, sorry, in Cancer, it's where it's also located. So it's not amazing in terms of the Aries ingress, but the cardinal ascendant is, in a really interesting way, ruled by Venus, and Venus is in the seventh house. And Venus is also moving towards, or moving towards a conjunction with retrograde Mercury, and both of those planets are moving towards a conjunction with the Sun. So for the Aries ingress, what it does, what it paints is a picture that sort of basically really, really emphasizes foreign policy, right? And foreign relations and foreign affairs. Effectively the whole shebang is very, very focused on the other and very, very specifically focused on foreign affairs. And the people are once again in this situation represented by the moon. We're in the third house, which is the recipients of a very specific set of messages. The government's attempts to legislate and control the flow of information, represented in the Capricorn ingress chart by that partile opposition from Saturn, is replaced this time by an applying opposition to the ruler of the moon, which is in the ninth house in its place, basically. So Jupiter is in the ninth house this time, not Saturn in the ninth house, but Jupiter is opposite the moon, which it rules. So the people are ruled by a planet that is again in detriment. It's not in the sign of its rulership. It's in the ninth house. And so what we find is that the representatives of the judiciary, the law courts, the academic institutions, the professors, the judges, and what have you, are still in an oppositional stance to the people generally. This is not a friendly position for the government to take relative to the people, but it is, in a sense, one that empowers us enough to at least have some measure of rulership over the public image. Does this equate to people power? No, I don't see revolution in the air in 2025 at least. But what we have instead is a whole bunch more influence from foreign governments over the legislative qualities of the country. Because the ruler of the ninth house, the ruler of Jupiter, is Mercury, and Mercury, like I said, is retrograde. It's retrograde conjoining Venus, which is also retrograde, and those two are retrograde and heading towards the sun. So the ruler of the ascendant, the ruler of the ninth house, the ruler of the 11th house, a whole bunch of other places in the chart, right? Even down to the ruler of Taurus, the eighth house. They're all kind of tied in to the seventh house. So we've got a massive, massive emphasis on foreign policy and the ways in which that can set up financial lines into Australia. Some of our money and some of our trade and the ways in which we generate wealth, and also our access to international money markets, which is the eighth house, are all tied into foreign policy and the extent to which we agree or disagree to the terms that are presented to us. Ordinarily, I'd look for, really sort of strong, well-aspected or dignified planets that are kind of in such a tight configuration in one particular house. But we've got fucking Buckley's, mate. Like, so the Venus in Aries, it's in detriment. Mercury in Sagittarius, it's in detriment. The sun in Aries is ruled by, a 10th house Mars in Cancer, which is the sign of its fall. We're kind of a little bit over a barrel in terms of how we sit relative to foreign governments. And I think it would probably gel with, for instance, a bunch of deals that President Cheezel is going to try and get us to sign or try and get us to agree to. Likewise, Downing Street, London. Likewise, any number of other shadowy deep state governments or shadow governments or groups or bodies that have enough bargaining power to strike deals with an entire government of a nation, not mentioning any names, a certain financial organization, Klaus Schwab. There's those kinds of scenarios, I think, from Aries through to Cancer that kind of make us have to realize a little bit that the foreign policy stance of Australia and the ways in which the government is trying to navigate us through these waters kind of has us pegged to a really specific set of government government sort of narratives that we're being fed, because we, the people, the moon, are down in the third house, and still a little bit sus. But more so, I think, in terms of the principle, because it's an opposition from Jupiter, rather than a reaction to legislative attempts, which is what we saw in Capricorn with Saturn in the ninth house.
And so with Mercury being retrograde with that, there's chances they'll miss small details in fine print and whatever of ways the deals are not as awesome as they seem and stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah.
What what sort of impact does Chiron being there have? Does that mean like it's more of a wound sort of thing, or we're going to heal some wounds with the luck? Is that a bright side at least?
Ah, no.
No, didn't think so.
let's just let's just take a mental health break, folks, and take a breath. Chiron's the wounded healer.
Yes.
One of the many times you've been on my podcast, Lance, we did a really good episode about Chiron, two of them actually. Check those out for a further sort of deep dive on what Chiron represents. Chiron doesn't have a place in mundane astrology specifically, but you can't overlook, for instance, the fact that Chiron at 21 degrees of Aries is opposite the ascendant at 19 degrees of Libra, and also in a square, yet another T-square, to Mars at 20 degrees of Cancer in the 10th house. The importance and the significance of Chiron in the seventh house means that we're wounded by foreign governments. We're also negotiating with wounded foreign governments. And the ways in which those governments either wound or are wounded by us, kind of has a direct relationship with Mars in the 10th house, the ruler of the sun. So there's a lot of, I think, there's a lot baked into this particular chart that speaks to me of a kind of recovery from a potential global geopolitical event between December and March that has us desperately scrambling to form diplomatic ties and to shore up alliances in order to kind of avoid, to circumvent. I don't think we get war in 2025, for instance, but in order to kind of shore up our defenses and to see where we stand. Because, importantly, the ruler of the ascendant is retrograde, the ruler of the moon is retrograde. There's a lot of retrogradation in the chart itself. And I think what that means for the ingress into Aries is a kind of immediate recovery stance. There's also a bunch of eclipses in March and April, and while we're not necessarily looking at transits in this episode, it is worth kind of exploring, at least from the perspective that we're talking about today, what those eclipses look like, and the way in which March and April just is generally chaotic. No matter how you cut the data, March and April is generally chaotic. Again, does this mean that your life is going to be turned upside down? Not necessarily. Not really, not by a government intervention per se. It's more so to kind of give you an understanding of where the leaders, our so-called quote unquote leaders, where their heads are at and what they're doing and how the government is trying to kind of move the fate of the nation in a very particular direction, while all the while trying to kind of feed us a load of bullshit, even though those planets are in a kind of separating trine configuration.
Yes, and as we've seen previously plenty of times, what they stress over and what they fuck up now, we quite often don't feel the burn from for months, if not years, sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Uh, and it's the Australian government. They've been making mistakes since day one. So bad news doesn't necessarily mean bad news.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's just bad news for Albo, I think. Unfortunately, shit flows downhill. So, I mean, sooner or later, we'll get a nice brown shower. But I think this is more so, the fate of the nation as it's represented by the federal government administrative structure is not in good shape in March, from March until July, basically.
Yeah. So if Albo's listening, is stock up on the Rennies to like deal with your ulcers and all the rest.
Oh, yeah, mate, you'll need a little bit more than that. Yeah, so it's a really interesting scenario with the Aries ingress chart, simply because of the way in which so much is pegged on foreign policy and on our diplomatic relations with foreign countries. Um, and there are some, like I said, there's a trine configuration from some of those planets to the moon. And I mean, like the moon is kind of separating from a trine, so it's not exact, but at the same time, the people are kind of a little bit more on board, and more in a way kind of digesting the Capricorn ingress to Aries ingress period of time and finding points of contention with the principles that are underpinning any kind of legislative change. But what we've also got, interestingly, that we didn't get the last time we did this, is we've got two cardinal ascendants in a row. And the significance of that, cardinal signs being Aries and Cancer and Libra and Capricorn, is that it's all about dynamism and change. So we've got a hectic first half of 2025, and the specifics of that I think are really, really heavily focused on foreign nations, basically.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, let's have a look at Cancer. All right, so skipping ahead, it's a bit of a different scenario for Cancer ingress. So by the time we get to June, what we have is we've got, again, a cardinal sign on the ascendant, which is lovely. But we have a totally different scenario in terms of how both the leaders and the people are faring. So what this paints for me is first half of the year, desperate scramble to negotiate with foreign powers, and a desperate scramble to sell off our resources basically as a means of shoring up political alliances in response to a pretty sketchy and unstable global geopolitical landscape, which may or may not have included by this stage small scale skirmishes. yeah, between nations, particularly between neighboring nations, as well as wherever the wider superpowers want to position us as an ally relative to their sort of global plans. When we get to the 21st of June, it's a different scenario entirely. So there's fuck all happening in the third house, which is great. It's ruled by an exalted ruler. By this stage, Jupiter has entered Cancer. Thank the gods for that. The sun is in the 10th house. Yes, there's a square to Saturn in the seventh, so the seventh house is still configured, but the sun is in Cancer. It's ruled by the moon. The moon is in the sign of its exaltation in Taurus in the eighth whole sign house, and Venus, the ruler of the ascendant, also really strong in the eighth whole sign house. The moon is forming a trine to Mars in the 12th house, Mars in Virgo. And, Venus is really not sort of aspected by anything. It's forming a square to the part of fortune, but that's a little bit too technical to be of any sort of statistical significance for us. So what we have is kind of a bit more of a chill period, and it's almost like that hectic rush to get through March, April, and then into May kind of calms the fuck down around the end of June. And we're in a bit of a better position. So, uh, you know, the ruler of the ascendant, the ruler of the sun, both really, really strong. The sun is forming an applying conjunction to Jupiter, which is exalted in the 10th house. Our public image and our profile is kind of bolstered a little bit more, right? The people are still literally kept in the dark because the eighth house isn't a house that aspects the ascendant. It's known as one of the dark houses. But at the same time, we're not being forced into a scenario where we have to consume great steaming piles of bullshit in terms of communication. Whatever happens to our communication landscape in the first 6 months of 2025 calms down and gets kind of brought under a little bit more stability, at least until we reach the Libra ingress later in September. The eighth house, which is really significant in this particular chart, its traditional significations aren't great. It does indicate death and public mortality and the national death rate, which I don't really see there being another kind of pandemic scenario, and I don't see there being global conflict. And so, what I'm focusing on instead, consciously, is the other significations of the eighth house. It governs financial relations with other nations, basically. And it includes international trade deals and other financial partnerships, as well as debts that we owe. I think what happens is that we sign some trade deals to sell off some natural resources to foreign countries as a means of shoring up political alliances. And, from June till about September, what we get is, we get the beginnings of those sort of benefits kind of flowing through more or less.
Yeah, I was thinking of well, we're selling off our resources stuff. They're signing some more contracts for FIFO, mine workers, and all the rest. Some of the people are getting some money.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but by transit, Jupiter's ingress into Cancer is in our fourth house, which is the house of natural resources. It's also the house of real estate as well. And between June and September, Uranus gets out of our second house and moves over our south lunar node for the first of three times. So I actually also am going to roll in a little bit of housing stress relief into the picture as well for that June to September period for 2025. I think that there'll be some nice shifts as opposed to shitty shifts towards things like housing affordability and what to do with the bubble, so to speak.
Oh,
Um, and
okay.
and I think what this might indicate as a result of the way in which our reliance on foreign policy and deals with other nations becomes more prominent in the first half of 2025 is a shift in the way that Australians kind of accumulate and store wealth at the sort of common people level, right? As opposed to the political elite level, because Jupiter in Cancer is always good for Australia because it runs through our fourth house. There are other indicators, like for instance, the multiple conjunctions of Pluto with our midheaven, which point again towards mining. The fact that Pluto's in Aquarius as well probably indicates that part of those deals will be to supply rare earth minerals to foreign governments who might be, for instance, trying to shore up their tech production capabilities in light of, changes to the political landscape in places like the South China Sea, Taiwan, etc. Either way, whatever we negotiate in the first half of 2025 has financial benefits from the Cancer ingress onwards, from what I can see.
That's good. Nice bonus.
It's nice, but Albo's not out of the woods, mate. That's the thing. I'll tell you why. It's good for us because the moon forms a trine to the ruler of the seventh house, so the people benefit. But does Albo benefit? Probably not, because you've got the sun in Cancer, 0 degrees, but you've also got Saturn in Aries for the first time. And at the time of the Cancer ingress, Saturn is at 1 degrees of Aries. It's forming a conjunction which will kind of be in and perfect in 2026 with Neptune in the seventh house. So, whatever material benefits we experience as a nation and whatever sort of benefits our treasury is going to be tied in a really difficult way to foreign countries and contracts that we've negotiated with foreign countries. So, while the people will benefit and while the nation will ostensibly look good on paper, there's a lot of devil in the details type scenarios that I'm seeing with that Saturn in Aries conjunct Neptune in Aries forming that applying square to both Jupiter and to the Sun. So it's like a rose with thorns on it, basically. Not to channel Austin too much, but that's kind of the poetic fucking image I'm getting anyway.
So this is where he says, "Oh fuck, what did I sign the other week?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Albo gets a national version of a mobile contract or a gym membership, basically, and gets fucking stuck for a while. But, at least we get some nice times, right? And we start to benefit from foreign money flowing in, basically.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. Nice. Cool. So that's pretty much all my notes for the Cancer ingress. And I want to just kind of quickly look at the Libra ingress because I think we're kind of back in familiar territory with Libra. Um, so this is the Libra chart. We're at September at the moment, and we're whizzing through this, folks. So it's high level. It's not completely detailed. I'm just looking at a couple of really salient points. It doesn't describe the full picture. But here we are again, and look who's in the third house, Lance.
Oh, we the people.
Yeah, but also the
Love it,
leaders.
Alpo. Yes.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And also the actual planet that kind of has this sort of ersatz relationship with the third house, which is Mercury. This time not in detriment or fall, not retrograde. That's nice. But what I'm looking at here with the Libra ingress is it's more of the same. We have a fixed ascendant for the first time, since I think our last Libra ingress. So, Libra is a continuation of Cancer. The second half of 2025 really is where shit kind of everything gets, all the pieces get arranged in the first half, and the second half, they all get played out on the chessboard. Pardon me, on the chessboard, strategically. Okay, so we've got the ruler in the third house. We've got the people in the third house. We've got the planet that represents information exchange, Mercury, also in the third house. All three of them are trining the midheaven. The midheaven is separating from Uranus, which is now retrograde in the early degrees of Gemini. And I think in terms of not really the people, but more so in terms of the government, there's this strange kind of harmonious alliance between the government and the people relative to information exchange and communication. I think given the way in which the seventh house and the third house, and also to a certain extent the 10th house and the midheaven and the position of the midheaven, which in this chart is in the 11th house, have all been sort of interplaying throughout 2025. What we see in terms of any potential movement from September to December has to do more so with the government in somewhat of a victorious position in terms of the ways in which it's managing the control of information. Um, and when we've been discussing foreign policy so far, what we've also been discussing um, is, other ways in which agreements with other countries can sort of see Australia as a test, a sandpit, a test environment for legislation that could be introduced elsewhere. I think the grand trine that we're seeing between retrograde Uranus, retrograde Saturn, retrograde Pluto in the early degrees of Aquarius and Gemini, respectively, and the Sun in the first degree of Libra, it indicates the information exchange and the ways in which information is distributed amongst the people and the people's access to information within Australia is going to be kind of a little bit of a victory for the government. It's going to be a win for the government. The people don't necessarily seem to be too impacted by that because there's not a lot of negative aspects to the moon in this chart. But what we see is a kind of big tranche of work in 2025 starting to take a measurable and effective form in the last quarter of the year. So there's going to be a change in the legislation regarding information in 2025. And I think what we start to see in terms of the government's ability to kind of successfully push that through is, from September onwards, that kind of becomes an easier proposition and whatever legislative changes that we see start to take effect. That being said, the Sun is still in an oppositional relationship in this chart and is implicated with Saturn. Saturn is still more or less in a kind of loose conjunction with Neptune and Aries, though it's an out of sign conjunction, and it's straddling the ninth and the eighth houses. And so what we might see as a result of that, even though we may not be given the full story, is foreign money and money from foreign governments coming in and affecting the legislature in a way that kind of hamstrings the government into enforcing rules that may or may not be to its benefit relative to the communication and the exchange of information, things like that.
So that could be other countries pushing forward the sandpit sort of idea of, well, we want to try this out. We're going to try and make sure it works for you guys, so that's
Yeah.
easy for us. Uh,
Yeah, because I think that kind of what, for instance, the social media ban represented for me was, that kind of first test case for a small to medium-sized nation for how much we're willing to accept the implication of a digital passport type setup in order to access the internet and in order to kind of receive information and for that to be kind of pushed into systems and structures of surveillance, for instance. It seems like a really weird thing to do. And again, like one of the things that might show up the difference between what we're reading for here and what applies to you is just how fucked that legislation actually is and how easy it is to get around it. And again, that's classic Saturn in Pisces and also moving into Saturn in Aries as well. Like the way that laws are enforced isn't really all that full on these days, at least not as bad as 2020 and 2021, 2022. It sort of seems to have been a little bit of a soft touch these past couple of years. And even though the name of the game in 2025 is information and the ways in which that's controlled and policed, the efficacy of legislation is not going to be draconian, in its effect. Basically, it might be draconian in its intention, but it's not draconian in its effect. So whatever demented sandpit they're setting up for us, potentially, if these, predictions are accurate, may not necessarily reflect the reality, which is just get a VPN. You know what I mean? Like it's just that easy.
yes. Yes. And mum's account now suddenly gets heaps of TikTok views because the 14-year-old daughter's using her phone
Yeah,
and the government can't stop it, unlike a cafe that you had to scan in and use your passport for in
exactly,
2021.
exactly. So that's the Libra. right? The ascendant, the sun rules the ascendant, but the sun isn't necessarily strong in Libra to begin with, and that opposition from Saturn and Neptune kind of besiege, not technically besiege, but they kind of put a lot of pressure on the sun. Um, but it's more of the same because it's a fixed ascendant. But then when we look at sort of the last part of 2025 and that next kind of Capricorn ingress, here we are again with a cardinal ascendant. So I think we get a measure of stability basically from the ingress into Cancer in the last week of June and all the way through until about sort of the middle to the end of December in terms of using the ingress charts, because what we have with that last chart of the year is the ascendant is at 23 degrees Libra, which is lovely because that's where Speaker is. It's one of my favorite fixed stars. But there's a square, there's an overcoming square from Jupiter retrograde in Cancer. And that's a T square. It's another T square scenario with, with Chiron at 22 degrees of Aries. And it's something that we will feel the impact at a personal level because the moon is in Capricorn, 17 degrees in the fourth house, and the sun is in the fourth house as well, and Mars is in the fourth house as well. So what it looks like to me from December 22nd, basically through until, that Aries ingress at least in 2026, is that Chiron's in play. It's a T square scenario. The players aren't all baddies, but there is a chance that we'll be wounded, in some way by foreign affairs. It doesn't necessarily mean bloodshed, but it could be that like those devil in the details kind of aspects of trade deals we may have signed in the first half of the year come back to bite us in the ass right before Christmas, which is kind of the way it goes, like you usually get laid off just before Christmas. And while I don't think we're going to be fired, I do think that we're probably going to have some sort of legislative backlash. Based on the deals that we have in place with foreign powers, and that we may have desperately or far too hastily negotiated in the first half of 2025.
Okay. So
Cool.
sounds like the main sort of things over the whole bit is really this media and communications. And so being wary of what you listen to and get set up for a VPN early.
Well, I mean that could also be what they make illegal as well. There's been talk of banning VPNs and things like that. And I think what we're looking at, though, with so much emphasis on the third house, um, and just one of those significations, for instance, is telecommunications. Like I mentioned before, there's also post offices and the ways in which information is exchanged, but also travel by rail and road. That's another thing. So there may be limitations on and stories that we're being told about our ability to travel domestically as well. But with so much emphasis on the third house, right? It's about information and disinformation in a nutshell. That seems to be maybe the first step that the government might be taking in 2025 towards setting up a landscape that makes it easier to mobilize a nation into war, which is on the horizon, but thankfully not this year.
That's a little bit of relief.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I guess what can we do about this as people, right? Um, and I mean, the message here is that information is going to be more and more difficult to access in a way that's reliable and trustworthy. Um, and I think we were talking a little bit beforehand, Lance, about ways that people can start to engage with their communities, as opposed to just, you know, eating the bullshit pie that we're served by the government, for instance.
Yes. Yeah. You've got local communities. You don't need to be focused on what the big picture is of what the government's doing. The government's going to always do what they're going to do. Make friends with farmers, make friends with people in your area. I remember seeing a thing like years ago now. I wish I remembered what country it was, but the internet had drastically been cut down in this country, and nobody could do anything. And the pirating of digital media in that country was was only like a week behind the rest of the world, because they'd they'd get somebody to either post in a drive with all the things they downloaded, all the top music around the world, of all the new movies and all the digital data that they could have, and scans of magazines and newspapers and everything, got shipped in, and they just distributed it around the country on USB sticks. And so they had their own internet without having the internet. Uh, and so there's different ways we can share things that you want to share that might be limited, if you make connections with that community. And they'll be good skills to develop in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I think one of the ways in which I've noticed this, and just even over the holiday break, was, I watch a lot of YouTube, just, generally when I'm scrolling, I like YouTube. I think that the YouTube shorts are hilarious, just because they're trying to be TikTok and they're trying to be Reels, but they're really not, and it's kind of this really bizarre sort of take on what that sort of short format video content is. And a lot of it just kind of immediately started to kind of take on the form of propaganda. And I thought, what have I done to enrage the gods of the algorithm to make them think that I'm like some sort of 18-year-old draftee who wants to join the United States Army? But there's a lot of that kind of managing of information and the insidious ways that it's going to find its way into your feeds, right? Whatever that may be. We're not just talking posters up at the train station and the Sydney Morning Herald anymore. What we're talking about is the ways in which government influence over information exchange is going to start to become more noticeable. Thankfully, for the first couple of months of this year, it's really on the nose while they try and kind of hone their strategy, so to speak. And so at those moments where you get that cognitive dissonance and you sort of get pulled out of the dopamine hacking kind of infinite feedback loop. Use them just to kind of question what it is that you're consuming, and where those sources of information are coming from. And like you said, go and make friends with your local farmer. And if possible, do it face to face. If you want extra points, then throw your phone into a Faraday bag and leave it at home, and then just try and do everything as offline as possible. But at least for starters, try and have face-to-face conversations with people to understand a little bit more about what's really going on versus the imaginal world and the ways in which that's constructed on webs and lies and a whole big matrix of bullshit.
Mm. And the other thing that could be beneficial with that sort of thing, if the media and the internet and technology is important to you, and it's something you care about, then you can be some of that thorn in the government side and connect with local communities and do protest, sign things, send them off, inundate the government with letters and signatures and all the rest to make their job harder.
Yeah, exactly. And it's big plans and minimal execution is what I'm seeing, right? So when we just looked at that from the perspective of the federal government, they're not 100% efficacious like they were, for instance, in 2020. I think that a lot of their attempts to be efficacious in that sense are going to be thwarted, not just by circumstance, but by the ways in which the people are going to take an oppositional stance to legislative changes in particular. So the joy of having the moon in the third house and having those two oppositions that we saw, one to Saturn and one to Jupiter, is that the people are in an oppositional position. And while an opposition in terms of an aspect astrologically can kind of lock you into a stalemate, at least it's not a free flowing steamroller type scenario that we saw when, like you mentioned in the last episode that we did, when the people just kind of bent over for the government, basically. And we all forgot that we're descended from bush rangers, damn it.
Yes, it's easy to see with that the government's in opposition to us, and easy to forget we're in opposition to the government.
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly.
it's whatever side of the coin you want to look at. It's not great to be a victim. It's more empowering to own your strength and do what you can.
Totally. 100%, my friend. 100%.
Mm. Well, thank you, Matt. That was interesting. I'll be interested to check back and review some of that as these transits are happening and remind myself along the process of where it is and reflects back of of how it starts to show up. And we just did that based on the federal chart, and there's similar processes you can do for individuals for their year ahead as well.
Yeah, definitely. Look, it's no easy task to make pronouncements about the fate of an entire nation, especially when you've only got about an hour or so to do it in. So I used a really simple set of techniques and did a very surface level reading. But everybody has a birth chart. Everything that has a beginning has a chart, and people are a great example of that. So my bread and butter usually is natal astrology and working with people and their charts to give them an understanding of what they've got coming down the line, often in a much, much more detailed and, granular kind of way. So by all means, yes, get in touch with me. You can find me at dragonstoneastrology.com. And also, I just want to give a shout out to my friend Mel Priestley, who has a bunch of excellent resources available on her website, which I'll give Lance a link to. Yeah, so it's melpriestley.ca. She runs Earthshine Astrology, and she does a lot of mundane astrology from a Canadian perspective, but she has some great resources. So if you've heard something that's tickled your fancy about mundane astrology and you want to look into it more, go and check out her website. It's also quite good.
That's great. Thanks for your time. It's been enjoyable as always. Anything else you want to tell the people before we finish up?
Yeah, look, I mean, all that's needed for evil to be triumphant is for good people to do nothing, right? And we probably shouldn't get too bogged down in the doom and gloom. It's fucking Albo's problem, basically most of what I've described. So just remember, there's a space for hope, and there's definitely a space for action. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, so there's a drinking game when we watch the news and we're seeing Albo sweat and stressing. You got to take a shot.
Yeah, yeah. Every time you hear the words misinformation and disinformation, no matter where you are or what time of the day it is, just pull out your hip flask and have a shot. You'll have a much better 2025 than Albo.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Matt. It's always a pleasure having a chat. I'll see you again soon.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and perhaps learned something new. If you did, I'd love for you to subscribe or drop a review on whatever favorite podcast you have, or if you've been enjoying the video versions on YouTube or Facebook, do it there.